Good afternoon, everyone. Time for another silver update. Following up on yesterday's commentary, I wanted to dig a little bit more deeply into the gold-silver ratio, and specifically the crime of 1873, or also known as the Coinage Act of 1873. This was the act that demonetized silver in the United States, ultimately ended up causing silver to be demonetized around the rest of the world, as we'll see. But this was a very key turning point in the history of money in the United States, and you can see it's marked by this spike on the chart here. So silver had traded in a floating exchange rate to gold over the course of these hundreds of years, and then starting in 1792 with the Coinage Act, it was at a fixed exchange rate, and you can see that it began to decay towards 20 and ultimately culminating in the breakdown here. So we're going to go and look at some of this and the history of it and why that's the case. Hopefully that's going to clarify why some of these things have been done and why we find ourselves in the position we're in today. So let's start with bimetallism. This is a Wikipedia article. In economics, bimetallism is a monetary standard in which the value of the monetary unit is defined as equivalent both to a certain quantity of gold and to a certain quantity of silver. Such a system establishes a fixed rate of exchange between the two metals. In 1787, the United States Constitution established gold and silver as the legal tender of the United States. A floating exchange rate. Okay, so this is key. The original Constitution of the United States established gold and silver as money at a floating exchange rate because the Constitution did not provide for a fixed exchange rate between silver and gold. Now, if we look at the definition here, we'll jump over to an article real quick on the floating exchange rate. There are economists who think that in most circumstances floating exchange rates are preferable to fixed exchange rates, as floating exchange rates automatically adjust. They enable a country to dampen the impact of shocks and foreign business cycles and to preempt the possibility of having a balance of payments crisis. So floating exchange rates are preferable. Now the question is, why didn't we have one? Well, it's because of Alexander Hamilton and the others who voted for the Coinage Act of 1792. The Coinage Act of 1792 established that the proportional value of gold to silver in all coins which shall by law be current as money within the United States shall be as 15 to 1. Proportional value of gold to silver according to quantity in weight of pure gold or pure silver. And they have also standard gold and standard silver. We're going to look at some of these definitions here when we look at the Coinage Act of 1792. So these coins are the coins that were established by the Coinage Act of 1792. You have the $10 gold eagle, the $5 half eagle, the $2.50 quarter eagle, the silver dollar, the 50-cent, 25-cent, 10-cent nickel or half dime, the cent, the half cent, and the millis, which I've never heard of, but that's interesting. None of which we have anymore. None of our coins are even made of copper because our money has been so devalued that we can't even afford to have a copper penny. So that's very interesting. Now, another interesting thing to point out here, they give the definition of what the standard unit is, and you can see the Act defined the proportional value of gold and silver as 15 to 1. Of pure gold, standard gold was defined as 11 parts pure gold to 1 part alloy, composed of silver and copper. And standard silver was defined as 1485 parts pure silver to 179 parts copper alloy. Reason being is that if you're going to make coins, you cannot make them out of pure gold or pure silver. They're going to wear too quickly, so they came up with the definition of standard silver. All of the coins were to adhere to that standard, and it was a very serious matter if they didn't. You can see when we look at the comptroller's requirements here. Quality control measures were implemented in that from each separate mass of gold or silver used to produce coins, 3 coins were set aside by the treasurer each year on the last Monday in July under the inspection of the Chief Justice, that's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Secretary and Comptroller of the Treasury, the Secretary of State, and the Attorney General. The coins were to be assayed, and if the coins did not meet established standards, the officers were disqualified from office. Further specified in Section 19, the penalty for fraud or embezzlement by officers or employees of the mint, or debasing or making currency to be of less weight or value, was death. So it was the death penalty to debase the coinage. They were very serious about having sound money. You can see that's very serious. So now we want to jump over to the Act of 1873, which is also known as the Great Crime of 1873. And I first want to start off with a paper written by Milton Friedman, and he wrote this in 1989, I believe. Yes, and he goes into this Great Crime of 1873, which was the demonetization of silver, and his purpose of this article is to show why it was a bad idea. He doesn't agree that it was a crime, of course, but he doesn't get into the conspiracy side of that. When we get into the conspiracy side, we're going to have to jump over to Charles Savoy. So we're going to read a little bit about how this act was passed and what happened. The Coinage Act of 1873, to which these quotations refer, was passed by a vote of 110 to 13 in the House and 36 to 14 in the Senate after lengthy, though superficial, committee hearings and floor debate. It attracted little attention at the time, even from members of Congress, including Senator Stewart, who voted for it, yet who later attacked it in vitriolic terms as a grave wrong, a conspiracy perpetrated by corrupt bargains, a blunder which is worse than a crime, a great legislative fraud, and finally the crime of 1873. How did this apparently innocuous legislative measure evoke such strong and contrasting reactions from leading scholars and businessmen? So he goes into that, and then he's going to go into the history. So let's go into the background because he gives a pretty good explanation. The United States Constitution gives Congress power to coin money, regulate the value thereof and foreign coin, and prohibited the states from making anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. In initially exercising this power, Congress followed the recommendation of Alexander Hamilton, passed the Coinage Act of April 2, 1792. That act defined the basic monetary unit of the U.S. as the dollar and defined subsidiary coinage on a decimal basis. Now he gets this grains wrong. That's 247 grains of pure gold, but that's not important. I have italicized 2 terms that are critical to understanding the crime of 1873. Free coinage is critical because it gave practical content to a specie standard by providing that the government mint would convert specie that individuals chose to bring to the mint into legal tender currency denominated in dollars, initially solely in the form of coins, later paper certificates as well, at the stated metallic equivalent. Both is critical because it effectively established the U.S. on a bimetallic standard. Now remember, and we're going to see this in a bit, it established the U.S. on a fixed bimetallic standard, i.e. a monetary standard that authorized free coinage and hence the use of money of either the 2 metals, silver or gold. These 2 provisions were equivalent to saying that the government would buy all the silver or gold offered at the prices of $1.2929 per troy ounce per pure silver, or $19.3939 per troy ounce of fine gold, 15 times as much for an ounce of gold as for an ounce of silver, whence the ratio 15 to 1. Though either silver or gold could legally be used as money, in practice only silver was used until 1834. The reason was simple. There was and is a market for silver and gold outside the U.S. Mint, for jewelry, industrial use, coinage by other countries, etc. In 1792, the ratio of the market price of gold to the price of silver was almost exactly 15 to 1, the ratio Hamilton recommended. But shortly thereafter, the world price ratio went above 15 to 1 and stayed there. As a result, anyone who had gold and wanted to convert it to money would do better by exchanging the gold for silver at the market ratio and taking the silver to the mint than by taking the gold directly to the mint. So you can see that this fixed 15-to-1 ratio that was set up by the Coinage Act of 1792, rather than creating stability, actually created instability. The original intent behind the Constitution was to have a free-floating exchange rate between silver and gold. The Coinage Act of 1792 screwed that up, and it ended up causing, we're going to end up with the demonetization of silver in 1873, of gold in 1933, and ultimately we're going to lose all real money. And it started with this act in 1792, moving away from the original intent of the Constitution. To put the matter in another way, if the mint were a two-way street at a 15-to-1 ratio, an obvious get-rich scheme would be to bring 15 ounces of silver to the mint, get 1 ounce of gold, sell the 1 ounce of gold on the market, and with the proceeds buy 15 more ounces of silver, pocket the profit, and keep going. So you can see in this scheme that he's outlining here that because you have the fixed rate of 15-to-1, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be mined at that rate. It may be mined, there may be discoveries of gold or silver, either way it's going to change, and in that case that creates this terrible incentive where people are going to dump. It's Gresham's law coming into play. The whatever money that is the bad money, they're going to sell it to the government and get the good money and buy more bad money, etc. So that's this cycle that's caused. And from that, he says, clearly the mint would soon be overflowing with silver and out of gold. That is why the mint's commitment under a bimetallic standard is solely to buy silver or gold, though it may, at its discretion, also sell one or the other or both metals. The end result was that the U.S. was effectively on a silver standard from 1792 to 1834. Gold was not used for money, it was too valuable for that purpose. Gresham's law was in full operation. Cheap money drove out dear money. Now we're going to skip and go down to the crime of 1873, but it's important for you to understand that history, because it's ultimately that history of the fixed exchange rate between gold and silver that caused the problems that ended up having this act being passed, or they at least used those problems as an excuse to pass this act. So in 1873 they passed an act that essentially stopped the minting of silver coinage by the government, and then Milton Friedman goes into the consequences of this act. Eliminating the free coinage of silver had major consequences because of one central fact cited by Mr. Linderman, the likely decline in the world price of silver relative to that of gold. Had there been no decline in the silver-gold price ratio, or as is more usually expressed, rise in the gold-silver price ratio, it would have been irrelevant whether the fateful line was included in the Act of 1873 or omitted. In either event, the pre-Civil War situation of an effective gold standard would have continued when and if the U.S. resumed specie payments. Now, if you remember, the U.S. went off of the gold standard in the Civil War. Lincoln printed up greenbacks, and that's going to come back into play here after silver is demonetized, because gold is going to impose such a austere condition on the United States and the world that then people are going to be clamoring for paper money. And you can see the progress as we go from a free-floating gold-silver standard to a fixed gold-silver standard to a demonetized gold-only standard, and then gold being demonetized, and ultimately we have nothing but worthless fiat currency. So that's the history, and that's how the intent of these acts, that's what they ultimately result in. So continuing, in either event, the pre-Civil War situation of an effective gold standard would have continued when and if the U.S. resumed specie payments. As it was, however, a rise in the gold-silver price ratio started well before the U.S. passed the Act of 1873 and was in full swing when the U.S. resumed specie payments in 1879. Resumption by the U.S. on the basis of gold was the final nail in the coffin of silver. The gold-silver price ratio plotted in Figure 1 fluctuated around 15.5 for decades before the gold discoveries in California in 1848 and in Australia in 1851. It then fell to a low of nearly 15 by 1859, when it started an irregular but more or less steady rise. The rise speeded up rapidly after 1870 as one European country after another shifted from a silver or bimetallic standard to a single gold standard, a tribute to the leadership of Britain. And this is going to be key here, and this is going to be something that Savoy is always going to be talking about, which is the Pilgrim Society of Britain, which is the bankster cabal which is behind all of this. So you can see that the demonetization of silver actually began in Europe. It didn't begin with the Act of 1873. And there's a lot of allegations that one of the reasons why it's called the Crime of 1873 is it is alleged that the British bribed American congressmen to pass that act by the amount that voted for it and the amount that voted against it. It doesn't look to me like they'd even needed to be bribed. It looks like we probably had the same level of dunces back then that we have today in the Congress. So not a big problem selling out the American people even back then. Germany shifted in 1871 to 1873 after it defeated France and imposed a large war indemnity payable in funds convertible into gold. France, which had maintained a bimetallic standard since 1803, despite first major silver and then major gold discoveries, demonetized silver along with the other members of the Latin Monetary Union, Italy, Belgium, and Switzerland in 1873-1874. The Scandinavian Union, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the Netherlands, and we're going to skip his chart here, and Prussia followed suit in 1875 and 1876, and Austria in 1879. By the late 1870s, India and China were the only major countries on an effective silver standard. Now, this is very important because with the demonetization of silver, basically it's kind of like a game of Old Maid or something like that, where as they begin dumping the countries that continue to use silver as money, they're going to be left with the old maid. So it's always in your interest to bail off the ship first rather than be the last one on. And I'm going to demonstrate that by going over to an article by Charles Savoy, and this is called The Silver Stealers, and he goes into quite a bit more history. This is a very, very long article. You can see it's 438 pages. So this is for those who really want to get into it. But I just wanted to touch upon this part where we get to see the impact of what these bankers did. Now, this is John Brisbane Walker, who founded Cosmopolitan magazine in 1889. And he made some astonishing remarks about the same factions who founded the Pilgrim Society in 1902 and 1903. His comments appeared in the New York Times, February 3, 1931, under Silver as a World Problem. Quote, demonetization of silver by England was originally worked by a few powerful financiers who saw an opportunity to more than double the value of their personal fortunes if silver could be demonetized in England, Germany, and the United States. Backed by those who held mortgages on property throughout the world and who saw in demonetization the opportunity to double the value of their loans, the most powerful system of propaganda ever organized was put into operation. Now, I wanted to stop there because that's important. For those of you who don't understand, if you are a debtor, then obviously inflation, cheap money is in your interest. If you are a creditor, then tight money is going to be in your interest, or deflation. So what he's saying is that these bankers saw an opportunity to double the value of their mortgages because by making it so much more difficult to pay back, the value of the money had increased so much that their mortgages would be much more valuable. Of course, we're seeing the same sort of thing today with the crash of the real estate market, and you can see now we're ending up with the banks and the government ending up owning all the property. Probably in this case it happened as well, where they foreclosed and ended up with the property. So bankers were behind that. I'm afraid they're behind what's going on today as well. So continuing, backed by those who held mortgages on property throughout the world and who saw in demonetization the opportunity to double the value of their loans, the most powerful system of propaganda ever organized was put into operation. It involved the reiteration by propagandists, unhesitating in their methods, by the exercise of every conceivable form of political and financial pressure. England's action was one of a combination among a few powerful individuals who were willing to wreck the world if they could double their private fortunes. There was an immense fall of prices and extreme suffering resulted. Now, let's get into some of the sufferings, because Savoy details that. It's not in the Friedman paper, but here are some of the real-world consequences of that demonetization that occurred. Quote, as if they had been a row of bricks, banks all over the United States fell down. Immediately, those who had been living from hand to mouth began a struggle for existence. Depredations occurred. I personally saw a procession of starving workmen, estimated to be 10,000 in number, tramping along the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal begging for food, ready to work for a wage that would barely keep body and soul together. There were 4 batteries of artillery sent down from Washington to protect the houses and the property of the Baltimore and Ohio Railway. Men committed suicide by the thousand. Everywhere hopelessness and despair settled over the country. Pressure was exerted by banks upon all who refused to accept England's single gold standard. The effect on India and China will never be known in their fullest horror. The immediate depreciation of their only stock of money, silver, stopped trade and starved whole provinces. It caused millions of deaths. Prostitute historians who have received grants and fellowships monies from the money power are intentionally silent on such matters. They're on the faculties of major universities and author lengthy books and leave out or misrepresent major details. A nationalistic Hindu source has this to say about the British action, and it goes on to what happened. So you can see that as the United States and the European nations and then other nations followed suit, demonetized silver, it left the existing nations that had silver as money, specifically China and India, with a devalued currency and an inability to trade. So this scheme, which I do believe was originally instituted by the British, and a lot of people would argue that Alexander Hamilton was actually a British agent. I don't know if that's true or not. But you can see the course of destruction, and this is just a small snippet. But as we moved away from the constitutionally defined bimetallism of the free-floating exchange of gold and silver and went to the fixed exchange rate of 15 to 1, which is always going to be a problem because silver and gold don't come out of the ground at a fixed rate, which is going to cause rushes of people in one or the other, turning it in, all kinds of schemes, and ultimately it's going to cause the demonetization of one, which was silver, and then the enshrinement of gold as the gold standard, which we can see the destruction that wrought in 1873 and following after that. And of course we know the later history of gold being demonetized, and so now we're to a worthless fiat currency. So that's the history of, brief history of the crime of 1873. Now you remember that the great orator William Jennings Bryan, who gave the famous speech about this issue, saying that man should not be crucified on a cross of gold. I think I can find that quote at the beginning of Friedman's article. Bryan said, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor, this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. William Jennings Bryan, 1896. So that caused a backlash. The backlash was not enough to have silver be remonetized. And so now we are heading into a world where, due to the machinations of these bankers over the last hundreds of years, we have shifted into reverse to where silver has been demonetized for so long and has been cheapened for so long that all the silver has been used up, and the situation has completely reversed as to where it was. And we have a lot of gold out there. We have very, very little silver. Neither is being used as money right now, so that's not affecting the bankers. But if and when it happens, and that's the purpose of my channel, is to encourage people to remonetize silver. If and when it happens that people remonetize silver, then what we may see in the future is, as William Jennings Bryan said, that the brow of labor should not have this crown of thorns of gold, that man should not be crucified on a cross of gold. We may find out that due to the machinations of hundreds of years of these corrupt banksters, that they may end up being crucified on a cross of silver. And we'll talk to you next time.